On May 18, 2012, a young man named Jonathan Hoffman contacted the police to report an assault he was experiencing. The unusual aspect of this case was the identity of the assailant. Jonathan told the police that his grandmother was shooting at him. The police quickly arrived at the scene, his grandmother Sandra Lane's home, who was 74 years old. When they arrived, the elderly woman was still in a state of agitation, holding her weapon, but she soon dropped the gun at the officer's request. Upon arriving at the scene in West Bloomfield Township, Michigan, the police found Jonathan lying face down on the floor of the house, having been shot more than 10 times by his grandmother. However, he was still breathing. He was immediately taken to the hospital with critical injuries. Sandra was also taken to the hospital for medical care, but under heavy police guard. Upon arriving at the hospital, Jonathan succumbed to his injuries, while Sandra told the doctors she was uninjured, indicating that her grandson had not harmed her. What could have driven Sandra to kill her grandson so brutally, especially when she told doctors he hadn't hurt her? This was the question puzzling investigators at the time. To find the answer, a team of detectives began to comb Sandra's home for evidence. When her husband, Fred Lane, unexpectedly returned, he was shocked and horrified upon learning what had happened. He told the police that he had taken the dog for a walk at his wife's request and had no idea she had a firearm in the house. Fred explained to the investigators that Jonathan had been living with them for some time, mainly because his parents, who lived in Arizona, were busy with his sister's illness and had sent him to live with his grandmother. The detectives found 10 shell casings at the crime scene and quickly confirmed that all the bullets had been fired from Sandra's gun after forensic examination. Sandra was taken to the police station for questioning, where she changed her story, claiming that she shot her grandson in self-defense, alleging that Jonathan had hit her, kicked her in the stomach, and threatened to kill her. The elderly woman told the investigators that she had no choice but to shoot Jonathan to save her life, as he was under the influence of drugs, and she couldn't trust him at all in that state. The hospital report clearly indicated that Sandra did not have any notable scratches or wounds. Furthermore, the investigators who examined the crime scene found no evidence of a struggle or fight, contradicting Sandra's claims of self-defense. Since Sandra stuck to her story, the investigators began working diligently to uncover the real motive behind the grandmother's shooting of her grandson. They conducted investigations into Sandra's personal life and her social relationships, especially with her daughter Jennifer, Jonathan's mother. Sandra was a retired schoolteacher who had been involved in volunteer work and had no history of psychological or mental illnesses. In short, Sandra was considered a model citizen, known for her kindness, peaceable nature, and love for charity work, which starkly contrasted with the heinous crime she committed against her grandson. The investigators then turned their attention to the life of the victim, Jonathan Hoffman, and his mother Jennifer Lynn. Jennifer had separated from her husband in 2008 and moved with her children to Arizona, wanting them to remain close to their father despite the separation. Although his parents were divorced, Jonathan and his siblings lived a normal life with their parents in Arizona. However, this happy life was short-lived, as the family was devastated when his sister Jessica was diagnosed with a brain tumor. The parents focused on their sick daughter, neglecting Jonathan, which his mother noticed. She eventually decided to send Jonathan to live with his grandmother and her husband in Michigan. The investigators called Jennifer in for questioning. She was still in shock and told them she could never have imagined her mother committing such a horrific crime against Jonathan, not even in her worst nightmares. Jennifer explained that her son had been living a normal, happy life with his grandmother and that she visited him regularly. During one of her visits to Michigan, Jennifer noticed Jonathan was smoking marijuana and using drugs, but she wasn't overly concerned, thinking it was a phase that many teenagers go through and that he would soon improve his behavior and give up these bad habits. As for her relationship with her mother, Jennifer explained to the investigators that she was not on good terms with Sandra. She described Sandra as a bad and violent person, mentioning that Sandra used to mistreat her when she was young and would often beat her for trivial reasons. Sandra wasn't only violent with her children, but also with her first husband, Jennifer's father, who left the family because of Sandra's behavior when Jennifer was still a little girl. However, Sandra's behavior changed significantly as she got older and married her second husband, Fred Lynn. Despite her bad memories of her mother during childhood, Jennifer believed that her mother had completely changed after marrying Fred, mainly because Sandra treated her grandchildren with a tenderness and affection Jennifer had never seen before. Jennifer's children loved their grandmother dearly, which is why Jennifer turned to her for help when she needed someone to look after Jonathan due to her daughter's illness. Jennifer's testimony supported her mother's earlier statement to the investigators that Jonathan was under the influence of drugs at the time of the incident. Sandra had mentioned that her fear of being attacked by Jonathan was what led her to purchase the weapon initially. Investigators began to look into Jonathan's drug addiction and soon discovered that he had a long criminal record related to drug abuse. He had been arrested once for driving under the influence of drugs, and when his car was searched, officers found some marijuana. Jonathan wasn't sentenced to jail for that crime, but was placed on probation. During the probation period, he was caught again with a drug called Adderall. In addition to his drug addiction, Jonathan was violent and suffered from severe psychological issues, to the extent that his grandmother had to call the police multiple times out of concern for her and her husband's safety due to Jonathan's behavior. About a month after the shooting incident that resulted in Jonathan's death, the forensic lab released a report confirming that the cause of Jonathan's death was gunshot wounds. The investigation also revealed that Jonathan had large amounts of drugs in his system at the time of his death. The report stated that he was high on synthetic marijuana, known as spice or K2, at the time of the incident. Sandra's defense team used this point to support her claim that the crime was committed in self-defense. Ultimately, the investigators decided to refer the entire case to the court and let the jury decide whether Sandra was guilty or not. The public prosecutor charged Sandra with possession of an unlicensed firearm and open murder, a combination of first and second-degree murder, allowing the jury to determine the appropriate degree based on the evidence presented. The trial procedures for Sandra began in March 2013. The prosecution rejected the grandmother's claims that she was acting in self-defense, citing a lack of evidence of a struggle or fight between her and the victim. They pointed out that Sandra's request for her husband to leave the house to walk the dog at that time was unusual and indicated that the elderly woman had the intention of killing her grandson. On the other hand, Sandra and her defense team maintained their original story, stating that Jonathan, under the influence of drugs, had a violent outburst, kicked doors in the house, and threatened to kill his grandmother, which ultimately forced her to pull the trigger and shoot him. The defense attorneys highlighted that the synthetic drug Jonathan had taken before the incident was extremely dangerous and impaired his ability to think logically or act appropriately, supporting the grandmother's narrative. However, it was clear that all the defense's efforts to acquit Sandra were in vain and failed to convince the jury, who found Sandra guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced her to 20 years in prison. She was also convicted of possessing an unlicensed firearm, for which she received an additional 2-year sentence.